Position time graph to velocity time graph examples. The following graphs are some examples of position time to velocity time graph transitions. If we consider the race of rabbit and tortoise as an example, we can plot both the graphs as follows if we take the change in distance and velocity. Again, if we consider one more example of an athlete in a marathon, we can consider the change in his position and velocity and plot it below. The slope on the PT graph shows the velocity in both examples, and the area under the VT graph accelerates the considered characters. Position versus time graph examples. By looking at the examples of the position time graph, we can understand them better. Consider a person going on a walk at a specific rate. Then he feels to jog. There is a transition of position with time, and by plotting the values, the PT graph obtained will be as below. It represents an increase in velocity. Consider a truck that moves on a linear path without taking any turn. If we plot the PT graph for its value, we obtain a linear graph representing the constant velocity. Position versus time graph. The PT graph generally indicates the velocity/speed of the body in motion. A position versus time graph indicates the distance of path that the particle has traveled, considering from its beginning point to the final point of the movement. It has a time interval on its x-axis and position on the y-axis. If the slope is steep, it indicates that it has a large slope, and the particle speed changes quickly. How do you convert a position time graph to a velocity time graph? To convert a position time graph to a velocity time graph, we have to follow some simple steps. We know that the derivative of the PT graph is the velocity time graph. You can also measure it by using the formula. If we calculate the slope of the PT graph, then we obtain velocity as a result. After obtaining the velocity, we can plot the v/t graph under it and calculate the area under it to measure acceleration. Is position time graph same as velocity time graph? Both the graphs are different from each other in finding some aspects. The main difference between the PT graph and the VT graph indicates the body's speed depending on the increase or decrease in the vehicle. At the same time, the PT graph indicates the movement of that body over a certain period. How does position and time relate to velocity? To measure the velocity of a particle, the concept quantities position and time are required. Should know the position and time of the object to calculate the velocity of the particle that is traveling. If any of the quantities are not known, then it won't be easy to measure the velocity of that particle. They are related to each other by formula and even by the slope of the PT graph that calculates velocity. How does position affect the value of velocity? The slope of the PT graph directly affects knowing the nature of velocity. We know that by looking at the value of slope on the PT graph, we can find the nature of velocity, i.e., we can say that the constant value of a slope on the PT graph indicates the object has constant velocity. Changing slope indicated variable velocity. If the slope is downwards or from left to right, it will be considered negative velocity. The direction of the slope of the PT graph represents the nature of velocity. Importance of velocity time graph. To know the measure of acceleration and displacement VT graph is useful. We know that we can calculate two different quantities from the two different elements of the VT graph, i.e., by knowing the value of the slope of the VT graph, we can find its acceleration. In the same way, by calculating the area under its curve, we can measure the object's displacement. Importance of position time graph. In the PT graph, we can calculate the distance traveled by the body in its motion and taken time. We can measure the body's motion at a specific time interval on a position time graph. After plotting the values on the x and y-axis and joining the values, we can measure the slope, and this slope signifies the value of the velocity of that body. Frequently asked questions, FAQs. How does constant velocity look like on a position time graph? To know about how the graph of constant velocity looks on a position time graph, we can see below. If we plot a graph of position with time and the body in the motion traveling with constant velocity, the graph will be in the form of a straight line. We sometimes observe the horizontal line on a position time graph, which symbolizes zero velocity. Can distance time graph and velocity time graph be similar? Two different quantities can be found on the position time graph and velocity time graph. The position time graph involves the object, s position change, and the time represents the amount of distance moved by that object in a particular period. At the same time, the slope or area under the velocity time graph line indicates the object, s acceleration within a particular time. What is the method to find out the VT graph? As the name indicates, we can use a graphical method to find the velocity value. First, choose any 2 points on the curve and find their coordinates. Take the difference of the two chosen points along both the y and x-axis. In the third step, divide the values of the y-axis with the values of the x-axis. The obtained value is turned out to be the value of the required quantity. What do position time graphs show? The PT graph represents the amount of change in the position of a body in motion. In general terms, we can tell that a position time graph can represent the amount of distance or the change in position of a body, taking into consideration from the beginning to end of the particular motion in a simple manner. How do you describe a position time graph? We can take the help of slope on a PT graph to describe it. In a PT graph, the change in velocity of a body is obtained by calculating the slope/steepness of the line on the graph. If the graph is linear or flat, then the body, s position is constant. If the line is steeper, there will be an increase in a curve and the body moves faster. Can we create an accurate position versus time graph using a velocity versus time graph? Cannot create the accurate position versus time graph from the velocity versus time graph. We know that a PT graph gives the total amount of distance traveled by the body. But on a VT graph, the slope signifies the value of change in velocity and gives no information about the position of that body. From this, we can say that it is impossible to create an accurate PT graph from a VT graph. What kind of graph do we obtain if we plot the position time graph of the moving truck? Here are some consequences are given below that might help know the nature of the graph. The kind of graph will usually depend on the nature of motion. The PT graph will not be linear to the x-axis since the time does not remain the same. Similarly, the PT graph will not be linear to the y-axis since it is not stationary, does not remain the same. It will not be a parabola curve as time cannot be negative. Finally, we can tell that it will have some measurable slope and a line to obtain the velocity value. Please visit our website lambdageeks.com for more articles on technology, engineering, mathematics, and various other domains. Scientific calculator and many more other tools.